Today we have Professor Surinder Jodhka with us. And we have been reading his work since our MA days about peasantry, about caste question, the thematic of the rural. And in 2023, when many themes have become, such themes have become unfashionable, it's really, really important that we revisit this question, which cannot be ignored. We might be behaving like ostriches with their heads in the sand, ignoring or thinking that this question doesn't exist, but this question is very much at the core of the discourse that is happening around us, especially with these blocks of developing, developed, and underdeveloped. When people think about all of those theories, those connections, the issues of capital, of industrialization, of deindustrialization, of urban, of peasantry, and that in the Indian context of caste, right? So all of this is at the core of this kind of an intellectual engagement. I'm thankful to kind of be an interlocutor or discussant or whatever. I also leave it to him how he wants to shape his own participation in this intellectual dialogue. And thankful to you, Dr. Zakariya Siddiqui, for taking our time to be with us today, and many others who have joined us from outside CSPS. And in terms of the CSPS, we were really happy that this is a really, really cozy gathering, and I look forward to a very meaningful dialogue with Professor Jodhka's ideas. Over to you, and Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi, he will take this conversation forward from you, sir.
Today we are here to kind of reflect on Professor Jodhka's recent work on the Indian village, the book that has come out. When it comes to a theme like Indian village or rural lives in India, I'm actually reminded of a statement made by Professor Dipankar Gupta in relation to Professor A.R. Desai. So Professor A.R. Desai wrote about nationalism at a time when most of the sociologists were not writing about nationalism. They were busy talking about other relevant stuff. And Professor Gupta, in his obituary, if I'm not mistaken, of Professor Desai, writes that in choosing to write about nationalism, Professor A.R. Desai decided to go against the current. And I suppose this is what Javed was also referring to, that perhaps village is not really a fashionable theme in the times we find ourselves. We are more excited by the urban, the cosmopolitan, hyper-consumerism, etc., and village essentially is one of those dimly lit corners of this Vishwaguru, as it were. So in deciding to kind of write about the village, and not just in this book, but persistently has been writing on the village emerging rural realities, Professor Jodhka has, just to borrow from Professor Dipankar Gupta, has decided to kind of go against the current. And that's, I think, a markedly academic exercise. Let me just, because it's a book that is very comprehensive and has as many as 9 excellent chapters, excluding the introduction and the conclusion. So it'll be impossible for me, no matter how hard I try at economy of speech, it'll be impossible for me to kind of look into each and every aspect of the book. But let me just quickly take a few minutes and reflect on some of the core themes that I believe remain critical to the very premise of this particular work. As has been the case in sociology in general, Professor Jodhka in this book, I believe from start to finish, is very much persistent about questioning the commonsensical in relation to village India or rural lives in India. So that is something that comes out very clearly right from the start all the way till the end, because I'm sure most of us would agree that there remains an alarming national common sense in relation to the idea of the village. And in that regard, he kind of does an excellent landscaping through the first few chapters and gets into a very robust literature review, at the same time, a very meaningful critical engagement and very informed sociological extension of the literature that is around since the 19th century on the question of village, rural India, etc. So that's the first. That's the formative part of the book. So that is how the landscaping is done. And then he moves on to some of the themes that are more contemporary. So for instance, the question of rural development, the intersections of caste and class. And I particularly insist that that's a chapter that anyone interested in rural transformation in contemporary India must go through as earnestly as possible. And then following that, of course, questions related to, within these chapters, questions related to new expressions of religiosity and the future of the village. So each of these chapters, all the way from the beginning, where we start with the idea of village as a certain kind of a home, and then village nation connections, and then following that, a certain engagement with the Indological, the historical, and then the ethnographic. You go from the early chapters and all the way till the future of rural India. One thing that comes out very clearly, I believe, is a certain, a very principled engagement with what we broadly call in fieldwork tradition, continuity and change. So in some senses, I think Professor Jodhka, and I stand corrected, is very much engaged in this idea of what has continued in the village structures, in rural lives of India, and what is transforming, something that we find in the early, all the way throughout the fieldwork tradition. So in that sense, I think his allegiance to the robust ethnographic tradition within sociology and social anthropology is very clear. So this is broadly, of course, about the book, but there's definitely much more than what I've just spelled out before you. But just to kind of share a few comments, and then perhaps Professor Jodhka can share more judiciously on the themes, the core themes of the book and the core arguments. I was just thinking about 2-3 things after reading your work. One is in relation to particularly this whole idea of communalization of rural India, which is something that some of us have been thinking about, reflecting on, particularly after the Muzaffarnagar riots. And of course, it is not to point out that rural India was completely insulated, because, and that's also an argument that runs across the book, that we cannot really afford to work with this separation between the rural and the urban, because the village finds itself situated in the broader socio-economic matrix. But I was just thinking about this whole communalization of rural India, particularly communalization that is also informed by sharpening of caste conflicts. And this is something that is, of course, specifically in relation to Western UP. And this is a geography that you're, of course, markedly familiar with. So this was something that I was thinking about, because I did not find much. So maybe you can share your thoughts on that. Following that, I was also thinking about this whole new religiosity that you refer to. And that's a very interesting argument about the massive following of these new religious organizations such as Dera Sacha Sauda, Radha Swami, Dera, etc. Which is, so I was thinking that can one make, because this does not come across, so I'm just thinking as a reader, can one make a case of some sort of a this-worldly religiosity in relation to the ways in which the villagers associate with these groups? Because one of the interesting arguments in the book is that most of the followers of these religious organizations happen to be women. And they go to these organizations because they genuinely believe that the guru can do something about the problem of alcoholism that is very, very pervasive and prevalent in the regions where we have these. So I was just thinking about a certain idea of this worldly religiosity in relation to this particular, the mushrooming of these religious organizations. And lastly, which is again to do with a more contemporary obsession that the planning state has in relation to smart villages. So that is something that I think in my reading did not come out clearly in the book. So this whole logic of smartness that hopelessly intoxicates us. And when this smartness is kind of implanted on the countryside, what repercussions do we think are in store for rural lives in India? So of course, these are preliminary questions. But with this, I request you to take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Javed Saab and Irfan, for inviting me and then engaging with the book. Thank you all of you for being here. This is the book, if you have not seen the book, right? It's published by Aleph. It came out little more than a month back, 1.5 months back. It's called The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century. So I think let me begin with that context. So the more we think about village, there are series of things that come to our mind. And actually, in this book, I begin with a conversation with somebody who is a retired bureaucrat at the Indian Institute of, at the India International Center, and he is himself feeling nostalgic about village, and he wants to talk about it. Not that he wants to discuss with me, but he does want to talk to me because he thinks that I'm an expert on the village. So it's kind of a book addressed to an educated middle class person. This book is not written for scholars. Not that scholars will not get anything out of it. I have other books which I've written for scholars. There's a book published by Oxford University Press in 2019, I think. India's Villages Revisions and Revisits and Revisions. But these are connected in the sense that I've tried to look at academic literature, bring my academic literature together as Irfan was indicating, and then trying to talk to that middle class person that yes, you know Indian village. It's not like you are ignorant or you are incapable of understanding, but there are also other writings on Indian village. There are other ways of looking at Indian village. And the fact that you have an understanding, which is partly based on your own experience, your own engagement with the village, your own personal life, but it is also, in some sense, derived from what I would call it the national common sense. So the word common sense is very common. I mean, we would not really question common sense. That is the biggest, what one should say, politics of common sense, right? Because we don't think of common sense as something which is asking us to do certain things. But anyone who has done a little bit of thinking or sociology would also realize that common sense is the most, let me use the word crooked, right? So all our relationships, all our biases, all our opinions are mediated through the common sense. We always already know about many things. There are many things we don't know about, and then we speak to other people and they try to tell us about them. Sometimes it is information, sometimes it is their own common sense or their own belief. Now, the word that we use in social sciences is called ideology. People think ideology is like theory, like Marxism is a theory, Marxism is an ideology. But ideology is also always uh, motivating action, right? Ideology is not simply trying to theoretically map out what connects with what. If you eat this kind of food, the chances of you are getting cancer is much higher if you don't eat those. So that is scientific work, which is not really politically ideological. It is also encouraging you to not eat that kind of food, but it is still not ideological, because what we are saying, what the doctor is saying, or scientist is saying, is hard empirical work, evidence based. The doctor would also, or the scientist would also write a footnote that this is only scientific research. This is what we know about it at this moment. Tomorrow I could be wrong. Ideology doesn't do that. Ideology gives you answer to your questions, how you relate variables, and then it motivates you. It asks you to act in a particular manner, which includes sometimes killing your own child or killing your own spouse. And that has happened, right? So patriarchy, the way, we've heard about what are called as honor killings, right? What is honor killing? Honor killing is part of common sense at some level. Common sense that we are a family, and families need to be protected. Families need to be protected physically, but they also need to be protected generationally. For generational production, we need to make sure that family reproduction happens within the same community, within the same, ethnic group, etc., etc. And if somebody is violating that, then it is better to eliminate that person rather than worry about your emotional ties with that person. So that is common sense, right? That is not ideology like you would think of, some politician asking you to vote for one party or the other, It's worse than even communal. Communalism is also an ideology where neighbors can kill other neighbors. We were talking about village, we'll come to that. Caste is an institution, but casteism becomes an ideology, which makes you think that this person is superior, that person is inferior. So why am I spending on so much time on that? We think village is a descriptive category, right? We think that there are cities and there are villages, but my argument is that the manner in which village has come to be understood, it has come to be part of our common sense. It is also an ideological construct. It is also an ideology. It gives us a commonsensical understanding about our own self, about others, about pasts, about presents, and about futures, and that you can already mark out on your minds. The moment we think about village, we think we are not in the village, right? This place is not a village. Some of us might have come from the village. Some cases, our parents would have come from the village. In some cases, we might have always been urban. So in India, there would be at least nearly, we don't have any study, but my own guess would be from 20 to 50% of urban population would have always been urban, historically speaking, from ancient times till now, if you connect their genealogies. And there would be many people living in Indian villages whose genealogy would be urban. And during colonial period, there was a process of ruralization, where because cities declined and they left the cities and went to the villages. But why is it that our common sense would suggest that we are in the city and there are villages, which could be anywhere between half a kilometer to 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers away, and they are different. And that difference is not simply the size of the settlement. The difference is also many other things. Occupationally, they are different. There are different kind of common sense that villagers have. We can think of them as romantic places, places where you don't have environmental pollution, where people live with tradition, people have some kind of intimacy with each other, they know each other, right? Everyone is in some sense integrated in some kind of natural economy and food, etc., etc. Things have changed now, but at the same time, this is how villages ought to be. And if you maybe go to interior, you would still find those things, people eating kind of good food and simple food, but not complicated people like us. Likewise, this idea also comes into academic discussion, right? When, for example, in 1950s, India becomes a subject for social science research. Not that you don't have an understanding of India before 1940s and 50s, but in 1940s and 50s, you have a new phase in Indian social sciences where people begin to do ethnographic research, field research, that we will go and find out what kind of people they are. Right? So you might have heard the name of M.N. Srinivas. Before M.N. Srinivas, also there were British colonial rulers, but they also pretended to be anthropologists. So the anthropology, sociology, ethnography means that we are not speaking just by reading literature or going to archives. We are going and seeing the place. Like this is a place sitting there. There are men here. There are women here. There are older people. There are younger people. There are people who look like, new to social sciences. There are people who are already educated. So on that basis, we prepare a report. Right? So that was empirical research. It began to happen in India in 1940s and it takes off in 1950s. So in 1955, there were 2-3 books that were published. First was M.N. Srinivas published a book called India's Villages. And these were books which was a collection of articles already published in a journal called Economic Weekly, which later on became Economic and Political Weekly. So these were the first-hand accounts of what was there in the village. So these ideas, in some sense, were very important. And that's why when I published the other book from OUP, it was called India's Villages in the 21st Century. So that was the idea, but subtitle was Some Revisits and Revisions. So what is it that M.N. Srinivas is doing? How is he working with a kind of common sense, which I find not very different from the kind of common sense we have. So M.N. Srinivas also writes that we need to study villages because villages are where we can document what our tradition is. Right? So there are many things happening there, that there is something called our tradition, which is Indian tradition. It's a pan-Indian tradition that if you go to a village and stay there for 2 years and you write about it, you would observe the structure of that place, that the way people relate to each other, on what basis they decide that this person is likable, this person is not likable. It's not simply a personal perception. There is some underlying structure of emotions, underlying structures of relationships, underlying structures of experience, which produces that kind of liking or disliking. So that is called, social structure, as we call it. So by doing that, you map that, and if you are able to conceptualize it, then you have a theory about what Indian society was. Right? So what Indian society was is something that is partly assumed that India was a land of villages, and that is something that Srinivas is assuming, that India lived in its villages. That is something that he shares with M.K. Gandhi. So that is the assumption. But then he says that what we know about India is all from Hindu scriptures, and that is not India. We know about Varna system from Manusmriti. We know about some kind of Hindu way of life from Varna, from Gita or other kind of texts. So he is thinking of village as a land of Hindus. So old village India was land of Hindus. That's why his village, he gives it a name, and that's not the name of the village. He calls it Rampura. Right? That's very important because there is a kind of notion that India is a land of Hindus. Hindus all lived in the villages, and villages had caste system. So these are assumptions that he's sharing with the existing common sense. But then he is also trying to revise that. That what we know about it is only partly true. That in the village, you have caste system, you have a notion of status and untouchability, but you also have things like dominant caste. In the village, you have caste system, and caste mobility is difficult, but you have possibility of Sanskritization. So there is a kind of academic engagement with the village, an empirical engagement with the village, which actually is not very different from the commonsensical understanding of the village, except for some details which are very useful. Dominant caste is very useful, Sanskritization is very useful, but the fact that it's a village, that India always lived in its villages, and village has caste system, and village is a place where Hindus live. Now, where is this idea coming from, right? This is obviously, we know that Gandhi popularized it. Gandhi was completely wrong. India is not a land of villages. India has not been land of villages. Where did Gandhi get this idea from? Gandhi got this idea from texts he read, which were written by British colonial administrators, partly to make sense of what India was. We have a historian who would tell us about it, but partly also to produce an imagination of India, an understanding of India, which would justify their presence in India. Why are they wrong? Why did they do this? They also have what we call as Orientalism. You might have heard the word Orientalism. So there was a construct of India. There was a particular way in which India was imagined in the 19th century by the Britishers, which would suit them, right? So if you look at 17th century or 16th century or 18th century, right, the place we are living, visiting right now, this was already a city. We know if we go a little further away, there is Mathura, and then there is Agra, then there is Gwalior, there is Hyderabad, there is Jalandhar, Amritsar, Peshawar, Lahore, innumerable places, Ahmedabad, right? These are places which have always been urban. According to some estimates, I'm not a historian and there was no census data collected in those times, but in the 17th, 18th century, when the Britishers are trying to establish their rule here, the urban population, absolute size of urban population in India was more than the total population of Britain. Percentage of urban population in India was more than the percentage of urban population in Europe. These are simple demographic facts. We did not have industrial city. They also didn't have industrial city. We did not have big city, but our cities were perhaps still bigger than their cities in the 18th, 19th centuries. And when they are coming here, and when they come here, they come to cities. They know. They land in Kochi. Kochi was always a city, not Kochi, partly the Malappuram, what is now called as Kozhikode, Calicut, right? Calicut was always a city, right? It was not something. Arab traders used to have connection with Calicut. And Calicut was not only a Hindu place, Calicut was also Islamic place. Right? You have these the Mapla Muslims who were kind of already in some sense, some of them living. There is this what is called as Arabi Malayalam, which is spoken in that region, right? You go further down in Goa, that's where Portuguese come. You already have Christianity there. Christianity comes to this part of the world before it goes to Europe, right? So many people would say that Hinduism actually is consolidated much later. Christianity and Islam are already there. But then they choose to construct a particular imagination of India, which connects it with Hinduism. And Hinduism for them was the most hopeless faith system in the world. That these are people who are incapable of being imaginative, who are incapable of being creative because they are divided on caste line. They don't have possibility of changing on their own, and they live in their villages. Villages have communal ownership of land, and they basically produce for the local communities, and they are incapable of having any kind of conflict with each other, and therefore there would be no development. Somebody like Karl Marx summarizes that argument. He also believed in it, right? That Indian village is the. And the same thing is being repeated by M.N. Srinivas when he says village is microcosm of India. This is where you see India. So the point I'm trying to make in this book, that this notion of village is mythical, it is ideological, it is empirically wrong, right? So another evidence that I give to it, apart from historically, there are plenty of evidence. I'm not the first person who is saying it. Actually, I take it from Bernard Cohn, who is an American anthropologist who worked on South Asia. He is the one who's saying that the Britishers represented India as the land of village republics because they wanted to convince their own people in Britain that they needed to be here for the good of India. It's only by Britishers being here. Karl Marx actually lauds their presence, that Britishers are now going to change Hindu village. Actually, you can read his writing Hindoo, that Hindu village is incapable of experiencing any kind of progress on its own. They are the ones who are going to demolish India, which is great. Right? So he actually congratulates the British without actually having been here. But that was the common sense which Britishers were trying to propagate. And if you are interested in read, you can Google and read this very famous poem by Kipling, who also wrote this Mowgli called The White Man's Burden. White man has this historic responsibility burden on it, that it has to civilize the entire world. Now, this idea of village remains very powerful after independence also, because Gandhi popularized it, but more importantly, it was accepted as common sense by the entire nationalist leadership. There's a whole chapter on it. Even somebody like Ambedkar gives into that binary of village and city, even though he is much more rooted and much more grounded, and he understands that village is, caste is not Varna system, caste is not about these things, caste is about power and exploitation and stuff like that. But Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, everyone accepts that. Now we all know about Gandhi's idea of village republics and village Swaraj. Gandhi has a utopian view of village, and his utopia of the village is not. Gandhi never lived in a village. Gandhi was an urban folk. Right? His family never lived in a village. Ambedkar also was not born in a village by the way. He was born in town in Mou. Nehru obviously had nothing to do with village. He came from a bourgeois middle class family, and his family was from Kashmir. Kashmir is Srinagar. From Srinagar, they come to the city called Delhi. They are called Brahmins. And when he is living here, his family lived in a place close to Nehru, the river, the canal, and that's how they become Nehru. Right? That's where the name Nehru comes from. And then they moved to Allahabad, and his father is a very rich person, very successful barrister. He studies abroad, and you know about Nehru's kind of jacket and flower and all those things. So these are people who have nothing to do with village. They are actually urban elite. And mentally, most of them are very colonial, right? Because they think that this is civilization. And that is what their education was. They were educated by the British, and they were also convinced in the colonial theories about India, that India was a hopeless place, India is now a backward place, India is underdeveloped country, and we need to become like them. Now, if you look at the history of rural and urban population demographically, Europe becomes predominantly urban only in this century. I think in 2007, no, 2007 globally, but Europe becomes predominantly urban only in the late 20th century, not earlier, right? Again, Europe has its own trajectory, particularly the white population, because they colonized Australia, Americas, and many other parts, and they killed local people, and this kind of. So there was very little population left there, and they could manage that population, and cities grew there. So that's not the trajectory going to happen everywhere. So this, at some level, book tries to, as Fan was very rightly point out, question different kind of binaries. There is developed country, there is underdeveloped countries, there is urban, there is rural, there is some sense tradition and modern. So these are all myths created to convince us that we are incapable of doing anything on our own. But at the same time, this idea was fought by the national elite, the nationalist elite, who led India's freedom struggle. After independence, they become the ruling establishment. And this theory helps them to imagine themselves as knowledgeable people. They know what is good for the village. They have never lived in the village, but Nehru knows everything what is good for the village, because village is imagined in a manner that, village was my yesterday. I am already tomorrow, and village was my yesterday, and I know what is going to be the future of the village, right? So Gandhi tells us how we ought to be. Right? Ambedkar tells us also that go to the city, there's no caste in city. Ambedkar knew caste exists in city. That's where he experiences caste himself. When he comes back to Baroda, he can't find a job for himself, because he can't find a house for himself, because he's a Dalit. And then he's telling us that go to the city, there is no caste in the city. Right? So Ambedkar is also at some level located at that moment. So this book questions that binary. We do have a city as a construct. We do have city as a settlement. But we have various kinds of cities. We have various kinds of villages. Himachal Pradesh, if you go to, most villages will be 20 to 50 households, no houseable plots. You go to Bihar, every village in most parts of Bihar would be at least 10,000 population, and there are villages which have more than 40,000 population in Bihar. That is based on landscapes. So similarly, we are also told that village is agriculture, agriculture is village. Historically, that has never been the case. In India, because of our caste system, nearly half of rural population was not allowed to cultivate land. So the idea of peasantry has been popularized by the left-wing historians in India and left-wing economists. India is not a land of peasant societies. The word peasantry again comes from Central Europe, people like Marx and Lenin. They popularized, Mao popularized it, and Marxists accept it because Marxists are also Brahmins. They inherit the same kind of binaries. They don't go to do field work. They think that we know what the future of the world is. We all know that they know what the future is. That's what gives them sense of arrogance. They behave like Brahmins. Ambedkar was absolutely right that these are all Manuvadis, right? So different kind of Manuvad, that I know what is good for you. I know what is good for working class, right? So that is the kind of image. We don't have peasant cultures, right? We have rural settlements where nearly half of the rural never owned land. They were not allowed to cultivate land. Then some of them worked as landless laborers with the cultivating farmers, but many of them had different kinds of occupations. They were engineers. These days, I mean, recently Ravish did an episode on a place where shoes are made in New York. Shoe making is an engineering task, right? So if you can make a shoe, you are an engineer, isn't it? Right? Even otherwise, lots of other carpenters, blacksmiths, whom we now have degraded using the idea of caste, they were actually local engineers. That's how engineering as an occupation emerges in Europe, right? Instead of upscaling it, we made them stigmatized. So that is the impression, that is the effect of colonial and Western imaginations on our cultures. So there is also then, it has a political purchase because the state elite accept this idea of binary between rural and urban because that helps elite to, at some level, produce a hegemonic position for themselves. You know the word hegemony? Hegemony is when the domination is accepted by the dominant, right? Because the rural people also begin to see themselves as we are poor people, we are villagers. Go to any village even today, there are Chaudhry sitting there, there are well-off people, there are people who go to Canada and America. That has been happening always. You go to Kamagata Maru, the first people who migrated from India to Western Europe, most of them were Punjabi villagers, right? They were the ones who were most adventurous. You know, those Gadri Babas came and did lots of interesting work, and that was happening from all over the subcontinent. So actual realities of village. So there is a chapter on it which is called actually existing villages. Villages were never stagnant, which was never stable. There were no difference between rural and urban. Yes, urban was urban because urbans were centers of power. Urbans were center of commerce. They were different kind of places. But we have different notions of, urban also. We have purs, we have pats, we have gardens, we have baths. All these are different kinds of urban settlements we had, apart from variety of rural settlements. So what I do is to also pose the question of village as a question of identity. Villager and city, we middle class people in India. I remember in Pune when I was long time back studying there was this word used as Ghati. That this chap is a Ghati. If you're Ghati, that means you're rustic, you're a villager, you have no sense, you're incapable of thinking about logic or anything like that. So, and also lost home, right? That's where my grandparents lived, and I still feel like going to the village. When I go there, I don't feel like I'm welcome there, or I can't identify with it. The village has also changed, right? So we need to think about village not only as a settlement, but also as a historical construct, also as a source of identity, also as a place which is internally very dynamic. As Irfan was saying, that all through the book, I have tried to kind of present the realities of rural lives. There is not one single life. There is plural rurality, like there are multiple urbanities. There's not one urban, variety of urban. Not that settlements are not important. Settlements are important. They give us identity. Spatial locations are important. Regions are important. But historically, if you see, all regions of India evolved around cities. Say, for example, language. What language is spoken in Tamil Nadu? Villages don't have their own individual language. No single village will have its own language. In Himachal Pradesh, you would say that after every 20 kilometers, dialects will change because interaction was much lesser because of this. But otherwise, if you look at India's region, they are cultural regions, and the center of that cultural region would always be some kind of urban center. So it's not that village were the microcosms of India. It was the urban centers historically, and around urban centers, you have spatial formations of various kinds. There would be towns, there would be villages, and they all belong to one elite culture. Elite were critical at that time also, and they're critical now also. The fact that they're speaking one language, that means they communicate with each other. How can you learn that language unless you communicate? So there would be villages at the distance of 200 kilometers in the same cultural region. They would know each other, they would communicate with each other. They would also actually have relationships. Right? We were talking about honor killings. What does that mean? That Jats have this tradition of not marrying within their own gotra. And there should be 16 gotras distance on both sides, mother side and father side, preferably. What would that imply? There's also village exogamy, that you should never marry within the same village. So how would you marry? So obviously you would travel. Your daughter is living in a village 30 miles away from here, but that's where you would find a match. So if your daughter is married there, there would be some communication. You would have known about them. So how did village become isolated? Villages would have never been isolated. Villages were always active. Villages had commerce. We talk about riches. We talk about spices. Why the Europeans came here? They didn't come here for tourism. So they came here to do business, right? East India Company. It was a company at that time. Who do you do business with? Here was the richest place. Where were the riches coming from? Urban artisans were there, but most of the riches were produced in the villages. And those riches were produced in the villages because they were producing valuable goods, which had very high price. And that price was determined by global trade. We talk about Ayurvedic medicines and we use the word Unani. What is the connection? Because our doctors and doctors from Yunan is Greece, right? They were talking to each other, interacting with each other, traveling around. I know about my Baba Nanak, who was born in Talwandi Sabo in Western Punjab, Pakistan. He was roaming around here. He went up to Bangladesh. He went down to, Nanded and all those things. They were traveling. He went with his friend Mardana to Makkah. So, who was isolated? They had some notion of communities. They had notion of traveling. They had notion of communication. There were languages. There were translators. So this whole idea of villages, isolated place is a very, very problematic idea, and it is a political construct. And that, in some sense, also then gets reflected in developmental theory. This book is being liked by people who work as development actors. Everyone is saying that, yeah, we should read this book, we should read this book. Because development studies people are doing NGO work, trying to help the rural poor. They have notions about the village which are urban notions, which are colonial notions, which are these kinds of ideological notions. And obviously, the student of sociology, one is also personally engaged with questions of. Now, I'll briefly kind of respond to what Irfan was saying, and then I'll kind of stop. And then you can ask some question if you have. Yeah, I'm not really in favor of this. You would not have seen these words in the book anywhere, continuity and change. No, I'm just saying that. Why am I not in favor of that word? So continuity and change implies that you don't engage with the idea of village ideologically. There is a kind of what Durkheim would call as village as a sui generis reality. It is out there as an objective reality. For me, there is nothing called village as an objective reality. The villageness of the village is a cultural construct. We call it a village. We could also call it Twitter, right? The same place. If we called it Twitter, it might have conveyed a very different kind of message. When you go to the village, Dalit locality will have a particular kind of name. And that name itself is humiliation. So why that name then becomes accepted even by Dalit themselves? हाँ मैं तो वो चमारडी से आ रहा हूँ. So what does that mean? So this is a construct, and construct carry value in them. They are political constructs. The moment the person says I to Chamaradi se aa raha hu, that means the person is accepting he is a humiliated small person. Likewise, when you talk about Shaheen Bagh in city, so there's a particular notion. These are Muslim localities. Therefore, there would be crime there. There would be poverty there. There would be ghettos there. Right? So ghetto itself is a kind of, so there is a particular way in which Vasant Vihar, Vasant Vihar is a huge slum. Right? Yeah. So you don't talk about Vasant Vihar slum, and perhaps more people live in the Vasant Vihar slum than they live in Vasant Vihar proper. Right? So there is a process of naming, and naming is not an innocent process. So for me, village is not a sui generis reality. City is not a sui generis reality. These are constructs. And therefore, they also have their own politics. And therefore, I kind of have a different perspective that we need to engage with those constructs as well. Because the moment we question the constructs, we would also see those so-called continuities very differently, right? Yes, second thing is about, I think you talked about communalization of rural India. Again, it goes with the same idea. At some level, it presumes that rural is sui generis. I personally feel that ideas would have always traveled. If Islam travels to rural India, if a particular kind of caste imagination travels in rural India, caste perhaps started in the city, not in the village. That's where even now today, caste associations are all urban. So the reproduction of caste is more actively done by urban ideologues, not by the rural people. Lalu Yadav is also an urban person, even though he would try to project himself, but he becomes aware of his caste identity when he comes to that college, when he interacts with Ram Manohar Lohia, not Ram Manohar Lohia, what was the other person? No. There was in between the person who became chief minister of, who was an OBC chief minister, Karpuri Thakur, right? So these are the people who are already in the city. Patna city makes them aware of their OBC-ness, not living in the village. Living in the village, you have jati, you have some kind of relationships. So it's the urban process which reproduces imaginations of caste. Right? Rural would also be part of the same process, and that's been traveling forever, not something new. So, and now there is historical literature available that even so-called medieval India, there were conflicts that were extending to villages. Villages were also killing each other, and neighborhoods. In urban area also, we have this assumption that that's why we think the villages are not communalized. Most of the killings happen within neighborhoods by the neighbors themselves. There would be people coming from outside, but neighbors, if they are not involved, most of the 1984 Sikhs survived in Delhi because they were very closely integrated with the neighborhoods and the neighbors protected them. Right? It doesn't happen to Muslims. So the neighborhoods also, that's why Muslims look for exclusive Muslim neighborhoods. There's no trust left. They move out because they can't trust. Sikhs did not move out. There's no Sikh ghetto in Delhi, even after 84. They were concentrated like they were concentrated earlier. So I think there is a kind of assumption itself has some kind of assumptions which we need to. Likewise, caste conflict, again, the same point applies. Form of conflict would change, but caste conflict exists in cities, and most violent caste conflict will emanate from urban areas, not from rural areas, and they would have kind of new religiosity is a very interesting kind of question. I think yes, this idea of religion being otherworldly itself is a part of the same Orientalist imagination that Hindus are otherworldly. The only thing they are interested in inter-life mobility rather than intra-life mobility. This was part of the colonial imagination, which we have accepted to some extent, that religion is spiritualism. Religion is about the other life. Religion is about moksha. It is about moksha, no doubt about it. It is about some kind of inner peace and stuff like that. But religion has also always been material. The sense that religion is like caste has always been material. My theory of caste is focusing on materialities of caste. Caste is not about varna hierarchy. Caste is about exclusions. Caste is about claiming entitlements and denying entitlements. So by denying entitlements, you get more share. That's how caste is an exploitative structure, right? It's an exclusionary structure. Caste is about materialities. So religiosity is, see, the word that I use in, I think it was initially used in my article in EPW on emergent ruralities. The word that it was actually used by Anthony Giddens, I use that ontological insecurities. Now, ontological insecurity is worldly and otherworldly, right? We feel insecure, all of us sitting here at some level, because we are living in city, we feel much more insecure than the person living in the village would do, right? We travel outside, and there's so much traffic, and all the time I was coming, and suddenly there was a motorcycle without silencer coming behind me, and it kind of full blown, and I thought this truck that has hit my car. So the urban noise creates anxieties. So with green revolution, with the increasing marketization of village, the old kinship relationships have collapsed in villages where there was kinship. Those kinship relations existed much strongly in urban areas as well. So because people are becoming much more lonely, they feel lost. They don't know who to talk to. And one of the reasons why farmers commit suicide is not because they are indebted, because they're poor. Poor people don't kill themselves. People, they beg, but they don't commit suicide. Why do they beg? A poor person wants to live. There are no suicides in regions which have very high poverty. Bihar has lowest suicide rates, right? Suicides are happening where decent people are experiencing stress and confronting downward mobility that gives them anxiety. And they don't have a brother to speak to. They don't have a cousin to speak to. They don't have a friend to speak to who would make sure that, their fate are kind of tied together. They fight with each other. So that is creating a new kind of ontological insecurity. And the relief they are finding is in religiosity. When people come to even go to what are they called? Those people who walk on the streets, cowards. So if you talk to them, they don't know much about Kavadiya tradition. They feel very good that at least now we are with 100 people and all of us are similar. They sleep together, they talk together, they don't have to worry about anything. It's a very liberating experience. That's why they do it. Otherwise, it's not only RSS mobilization or Shiv Sena's mobilization. There is something in it. Right? So I think that's where sociology lies. So it is this worldly and also other world. Right? So there is faith that, yeah, this Baba has a magical power. Also, apart from that, the new community that they go together, they kind of then, in some sense, yeah, smartness is kind of most vulgar way of engaging with rural realities, and that vulgarity comes to us from the new liberal capitalism. New liberal capitalism itself is so vulgar even to look at. Just you have huge buildings, but no human beings. You don't talk about just sitting together and listening to music. It's all at some level exhibition of wealth. And I think that language, why should you use the word smart when you're talking about at some level, even the right wing, Hindu right wing, why should this government use words like smart village or smart cities? If you're talking about neighborhoods, if you're talking about culture, if you're talking about some form of tradition, tradition is a misnomer also. The word tradition is very problematic. There's nothing called tradition. All of us have tradition and all of us need tradition. There's no culture, no society possible without tradition. So, but this kind of, so village is never static. Village is always an open space, but there are villages, and therefore we also need to talk about it. This movie is like, I look at Gandhi in two phases. First phase of Gandhi is this very Orientalist, and second phase of Gandhi is what you were talking about, and that's what I am also knowing, that there is also village. Gandhi was trying to make people like Nehru feel apologetic that you don't know anything about India, man. I think that's where Gandhi was completely right. He was actually trying to be sensitive to those realities. And he's actually aghast when he actually goes to villages. He finds dirt there. He finds untouchability, and he's not comfortable with untouchability. He's happy with caste system, right? So, the final objective of writing this book is also precisely this: that we need to talk about village. And I should have brought the table here, not this kind of table, the other table. India is urbanizing, right? India had around 10% urban population in the beginning of 20th century. Now we have around 65 to 67, 35 to 37% urban population. We have not done last census, but minimum 35, which would be demographically urban. And rural from 90, it has come down to 33, 35, or whatever it is. India had more urban population in the beginning of 18th century or at the end of 18th century than it had at the beginning of 20th century. The rural population has declined in relative terms, but there are more people living in rural areas than they have ever lived. India's rural population, absolute size of rural population, is around 5 times more than what it was a century back. The beginning of 20th century, if there were 28 crores people who lived in rural areas, now it's 4 times of that. Right? So rural is not going away globally. That was the figure of 2007. Urban population becomes more than rural population, but rural population is still increasing. The number of people living in rural areas globally is higher than ever before. Right? So it's not like this, one is going up and the one is going down. That's not the case. The actual trajectory, demographic trajectory is very different. And that is also something that developmental state needs to recognize. We need to recognize, social scientists need to recognize.
Thank you, sir, for this very succinct summary of the book, and also sort of drawing our attention to a range of arguments that remain very crucial for understanding the emergent ruralities. I just want to add one thing, because sir has also spoken about how the book kind of contests a range of binaries. There's one more binary that I completely forgot to refer to, which is the Gandhi-Ambedkar binary. That is also contested quite forcefully. And I particularly recommend, of course, I recommend the entire book, but this particular chapter is of extraordinary worth for those who are interested in modern South Asia, history of ideas, etc., where Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Nehru are kind of, Professor Jodhka looks at these three in terms of a certain common ground. And this is a rarity, particularly Gandhi Ambedkar, because again, those who work on modern South Asia look at Gandhi and Ambedkar as two opposite camps for a variety of informed reasons. But when it comes to the idea of the village, they both believe that this happens to be a Hindu village. And I think that's where they are found in an embrace, which is, as I said, an absolute rarity. So that's another binary that we end up contesting in this book.
Thank you very much for very highly, illuminating lecture, but also for our young students, because the stereotyped version of Orientalist thinking continues to dominate. It does not matter how much you say about these things, but it does have its own weight over the minds of people. There are so many things to actually discuss, but just one thing about this, the idea that you mentioned about the reproduction of caste in urban centers. But in after the neoliberal, regime, we see a kind of reversing of that dynamics, where the underdogs of the rural India moves to urban India and becomes anonymous and loses its caste identity. But I do understand and agree that the other side of the story is, as even today, is valid and true. But how does this dynamics actually play and sustain itself? Is the root or mechanism of that is not very, very clear to me. So could you elaborate on that?
I mean, there's a lot of empirical work now available on precisely on this thing. Actually, what has happened in the neoliberal context, where nature of employment has changed. Earlier, there were railways where people are hired by the state. And they have some kind of security, job security, pension, and that also shape mobility patterns. So what is happening now is, for example, all these security guards and class 4 people that perhaps we have in mind, construction workers, they don't come here as individuals trying to find jobs. They are recruited through middle persons. I think Jan Bremen's work is very useful. There was a special issue of contributions on rural labor, where they are talking about this. So this whole mobilization process of labor recruitment has actually become much more caste community specific. Instead of making it anonymous, it's actually less anonymous now. You go and talk to the security guards in University of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Large majority of them would be Bhumihars from Bihar. Why Bhumihars? Because you are wearing a dress and you're standing like this. You are not doing construction labor. Muslim labor from Madhubani villages goes, and this is my own empirical work, goes to what is that place near Bombay, Bhiwandi, right? Because that's where they have network. So these are migrations at the lower end also are happening through networking. It's very difficult to just go and live in the city. So Dalit migrations would end up in the lowest paying jobs. Like again, if you go to, my area, Arkepuram, and if you look at all the vegetable vendors, and you speak to them, they're all from one village, one community, one caste. They're all aligned to some network who would protect them and who would also negotiate their relationship with the local, whatever politician. So these are not random things as they appear, right?
They are not as random as they
No,
have
no. Actually, caste has become much more significant even for the middle classes now because of withering insurance of life by the state. So your caste communities are becoming your insurance. This is something that, I mean, we have a book coming out. It's actually already published called Oxford Handbook of Caste. So there's a whole section on caste and economy. And everyone is there's also empirical literature other people are producing. It's coming out that with neoliberal capitalism, your networks become much more critical. This came out in our study earlier that we had worked on corporate hiring. Corporate hiring is much more through networks rather than anonymous. Earlier, it used to be you write an exam, you become a babu, and then you promote yourself or probationary officer. These days, you have to look for this, except for IAS and a few other exams. Most of the jobs are not advertised. Go to Naukri.com or some other references become.
Thank you. But it also kind of triggered. Let me use this controversial word. It triggered a few thoughts. I thought like maybe I should design a course on the history of Indian village, the intellectual history of Indian village itself. Because in history also we do a lot of reading of material where colonization as a process is understood as if the village, the rural, the peasant, quote unquote, appears once in a while, and then the larger discourse is about the history, the grand history of modernity, if you like. But at the same time, conceptually, I also thought that both of your the conversation that you had, scholarly conversation, that the foundations that you touched upon, it also made me think about in theory, in philosophy, the concept of a utopia and dystopia. And then also, as Hobsbawm and Terence has worked on the invention of tradition, why would somebody want to invent? So what is this tradition? When did it begin? When did you become conscious of something called a tradition? And, this Benedict Anderson, Gallner, and then this Hobsbawm, one thing that we might not agree completely with them, but one thing definitely becomes quite evident is that tradition itself got invented in certain ways, which is so wonderfully laid out in front of us by Professor Jodhka. Another thing is also like the way urban studies have engaged with the question, a Lefebvrean way of place making and space making, but also can we kind of shift that and start questioning those frameworks in terms of place making and space making in this new material that we have right now with us, right? And the third thing is that this kind of conversation was already happening, but maybe somebody hasn't confronted this question, head on. Because if you look at the commission reports, the Royal Commission reports about the labor, all the commissions on labor, one comment that the colonial government was always making was that the rural peasantry, which has now arrived into the towns and the cities, is undisciplined, right? So this notion of violence and that is also kind of has certain roots, and the discourse itself was produced historically. Second thing is about, like, for example, historians like Raj Narench and the worker, who in the context of Bombay and in Calcutta you have this Shubha Vasu, and others who have constantly worked about this making of this figure of the urban. But with the moment you start constituting what is urban, there's a constant, let's say, imagination of what the non-urban, which of course ends up being the village, is or is not. So there's a lot of mythology that goes around in the making of these concepts, and thank you. It has given me a lot of material to think about, and I'm not the one who kind of responsibility. I will need some time to mull over these ideas, and definitely going to read the chapter. I'm currently, and what makes me more interested in this question is because I'm also once in a while I teach this BA students this course on modern Indian political thought, and since Gandhi and Ambedkar are here, and I just finished teaching Tagore, whose name we did not take.
Is also there.
Yeah. So I think I think maybe this also has invited me to engage with the course I'm teaching right now in a different milieu altogether. But thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for taking our time, for making this conversation much more vibrant. Thank you, Dr. Zakariya Siddiqui, for making our time today, Dr. Irfanullah, and above all, the main speaker of the event, Professor Surinder Jodhka, not only for the talk, but sir, for writing this book. For writing this book. Thank you so much.
That is more important.